I was very fortunate to grow up in a family that would frequently have gatherings and reunions. And whether it would be at my own house, or at my Uncle Mike's house, or at my grandmother's, all 8 or 9, depending on who was in town, of my mom's siblings would gather, bringing whatever they brought, whether it be a pizza social or a barbecue hangout, or if we were deep frying turkeys. And we would gather in this meeting. And I remember as a kid loving these times, not only because I got to play with my cousins and pick on my little sister in other more creative ways since I had help with my cousins, but because I got to learn about who I am. I was able to learn my identity, where I come from, to learn the stories of my grandfather, who I never had the chance to meet, to learn the stories of my uncles when they were teenagers and kids, to hear about the love that my grandmother had for my grandfather. Those family gatherings were incredible moments in my life, revolving around a meal. Our first reading today describes for us what is called the meal cult of Judaism. Judaism and all the rules and laws that we think of and we hear of, the majority consists in how you are to come together for sacrifice and to eat food. Oftentimes, I think we tend to ponder on the Jewish faith and the sacrifices as this one big event that the animal is sacrificed and then done away with. However, the animal would be sacrificed with the choice portions being offered to the priest and offered up in prayer, and the rest was shared. And so whoever brought the cow was offering that cow not only for his own family as a meal, but for his community. And whoever decided to put a side of dove with it would contribute that also to this meal. And that as they sat together in this meal, in this place of the Holy of Holies, their temple, they recognized amongst one another the presence of God. Our second reading, we hear from St. Paul to the Corinthians. The one point I'd like to make is Paul wrote his letter to the Corinthians probably within the years of 40 to 50. Jesus died in the year 33, 35, in that realm. And so this is something that Paul is describing from what he has learned and what Paul has been given, already so cemented within the thought process of these Christians, within their tradition, is that when they come together at table, this is who they are. Recognizing Christ offering himself once again in the Eucharist. In our gospel, Jesus introduces the gospel by saying that Father has given me all power. Now, if the Father had given me all power, I would have gone into Hulk mode or gained some superpower, having received this tremendous power and authority. Jesus takes up all the power that has been entrusted to him, his divine right, his authority, and wraps a towel around his waist and kneels down on a dirty floor to wash dirty feet. In so doing, Jesus established a custom for us, a custom of service, so that when we do come together, when we do gather at table, we recognize that we are gathering as of a service to one another. The fourth tangent now. I found out Tuesday I will be assigned to St. Lawrence Catholic Church in Tampa. Which sadly makes this my last Triduum with you all. Shh, the pastor's right there. Which means that we will be in separate places. Which means I will not be coming back here to serve anymore. You won't be able to see my cute face and pinch my cheeks after. We will be gathering for the Eucharistic meals in radically different places. And whether your families are here or spread out, when we gather together at this table, we gather as family, with a culture, a tradition, an identity. We gather here the same evening and the same moment when Christians or Catholics throughout the world gather, whether they are the Ethiopian Catholics being persecuted, the Egyptian Coptics, the Syrian Catholics, whether they're Catholics who are in Vietnam or North Korea who are still living underneath persecution, whether they're Catholics in some place in South America or Africa that are in absolute poverty. We gather with them this night, around this table, to share a meal. What always impressed me at my family gatherings is my grandmother. After the meal was done, she was first in the kitchen, first to wash dishes, kicking everyone else out, because it's what she felt she could offer most and care. My grandmother set that example for us of loving and caring means serving, doing the worst job. Let us take up this example which Christ has given us. That as we come to this table where we recognize our identities, not a formality, not a simple, nice custom, but who we are. Be mindful with me of the many Christian brothers and sisters who gather this night in secret, in persecution. And be mindful of the many ways in which we can be of greater service to one another and our own family.
On this Good Friday, having just heard this reading of the narrative of the Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Church would have us reflect on the mystery of suffering, both in the life of Jesus and in our own lives. And one of the wonderful things about our Catholic faith is that it's so balanced. For example, we never speak of suffering as being good in itself. What we say is that good can be brought out of suffering. And that's what Jesus did on Good Friday. For example, when you look at Jesus on Good Friday, we would say that his betrayal was not good. His scourging was not good. His crucifixion was not good. His resurrection was wonderful. His work of redemption was glorious. In other words, we call Good Friday good, not because of the bad things that happened to Jesus in themselves, but we call Good Friday good because of all the good that Jesus brought out of those bad things. And in our own lives, it is most important to us that all the suffering that you and I go through in this life should have some meaning and purpose and value. And we feel it simply must contribute to some higher good, or else it becomes unbearable. If I were to use an example, I was talking one time with a Vietnam War veteran who told me that he was in a platoon that was part of the assault on Hamburger Hill. And he told me that for 11 days in a row, his platoon and others like it would fight their way up the hill against the enemy, only to be turned back down again. Finally, on the 11th day, he said they were able to reach the top and to take the hill from the enemy. And when I asked him how many men in his platoon had died during the assault, he said they started out with 24 men, and 11 days later, they were down to just 3. But he said that absolutely the worst part of the story was that within a few days, he and the other American soldiers were given the order to completely abandon Hamburger Hill, as it was deemed to have no strategic value whatsoever, so that all those men who had given their lives in taking the hill, he said, had simply died in vain. And he saw that as an absolute waste of human suffering. You and I cannot endure meaningless suffering. And the idea of a person suffering without any good coming out of it is deeply offensive to us. And I think that's why the notion of hell, for instance, is so troubling to us. It's because the idea of a person suffering with no possibility of any good ever coming out of it would be a complete disaster to us. Because in our way of thinking, we simply feel that a person must find a way to bring some good out of suffering. That's what Jesus did for us on Good Friday. Now, before Good Friday, there was no real value to human suffering. The gates of heaven were closed with the sin of Adam and Eve. We were all going to hell, and there was nothing we could do about it. And all the suffering in this world wasn't going to do us any good at all. Our suffering had no real or lasting value that carried beyond the grave, but would all be in vain like a Hamburger Hill. But on Good Friday, Jesus walked up another hill, and when he died for us on the cross, he embraced suffering and gave it a lasting value, so that not only does his own life have value, but our lives as well. And you and I are called to do the same. We are called to give value to our suffering. And one way our sufferings are given value is by the way we choose to go through them. So, for example, you and I may go through the very same difficulty, but if you go through it working with God's grace and I don't, then your sufferings will have value and mine won't. And going through the exact same experience, you will become better and I will become better. I think a good example of this is the 2 thieves on the cross who were crucified with Jesus, both of whom went through the exact same suffering in the very same situation. But one of them cooperated with grace and the other one didn't. And it made all the difference in the world. So in the way you and I choose to go through something, we can either give some value to it and bring some good out of it, or we can just make it an even more painful experience and make of it a Hamburger Hill with no redeeming value. In a few moments, we will have the veneration of the cross. And the cross, of course, is the symbol of those sufferings in our life. And I think you know that when we come forward for the veneration, and when you kiss or touch the cross, it's not saying that you like the cross, or that you want more suffering in your life, or anything like that. It simply means that you understand the value of the cross in your life, and that if you have to suffer, just like Jesus suffered, you want to bring as much good out of it as you can. This is our Easter Vigil when we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And it's important to understand that the only thing that God the Father ever called Jesus to was the resurrection. And that could be hard to believe when Jesus went through his passion, because watching Jesus go through all of that, you could think that God was calling Jesus to scourging, to crucifixion, to suffering, and to death. But the only thing God ever called Jesus to was the resurrection and life. For example, did God call Jesus to be crucified in Jerusalem? No. God called Jesus to go to Jerusalem to proclaim the good news. But allowing that he went to Jerusalem to proclaim the good news, and allowing that some people didn't like it, they crucified him. But the only thing that God ever called Jesus to was resurrection and life. And that's what we celebrate in this Easter Vigil, is the fact that our God is a God of life and not death. And no matter what it may look like, the only thing that he ever calls us to is life. And I'll give you an example of this from one of our readings tonight. And it's the story of Abraham and the test of faith of Abraham. And the test of faith of Abraham, of course, had to do with his son Isaac and the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, if you've never heard this before, Father Nisbet says that it could well be that the real test of faith for Abraham was not whether or not Abraham could kill Isaac, but whether or not Abraham could let Isaac live. Because in the ancient world, at the time of Abraham, everyone killed their firstborn child as a sacrifice to the gods. Now, if I tell you the logic of it, I'm sure you'll agree it's very logical. It's just tragic that they did it. But everyone killed their firstborn child because they reasoned that once they had sacrificed their firstborn child to the gods, then the gods would know how devoted they were to them, and then they would have the blessing and the protection of the gods. Well, when Isaac turned 12, the age at which a boy becomes a man legally in the ancient world, Abraham decided that it was now or never. Either he was going to sacrifice Isaac now, or he never would. So Abraham decided to pay this debt to the gods. Now, question. Did God actually tell Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? You know, it's possible. It certainly appears that way in the text. But we also know the rest of the story, namely that God did not ask him to carry it out. So it could be that God asked Abraham to make that sacrifice. Or it could be that Abraham just thought that's what God wanted, because that's what everyone thought the gods wanted, was the sacrifice of the firstborn. But whatever the case, Abraham went up to the mountain of sacrifice. And he bound Isaac, he raised the knife, he was about to sacrifice his son when the true God revealed himself and basically said, I'm a God of life, not death. And if you really want a test of faith, God says to Abraham, can you go back into that community of people, every one of whom has killed their firstborn child with your child still alive? Now, no one would ever kill their firstborn child easily. And I doubt if any of those people would have done it unless they felt they had to do it. So can you imagine the resentment those people must have had toward Abraham when he came down the mountain of sacrifice with his child still alive and their child was dead? They must have thought, who does this guy think he is, that he can defy the gods in that way and withhold his son? And worse, when the people saw how blessed Abraham went on to become, how blessed by God, they must have thought, oh my gosh, we've killed our child. And maybe that's not what the gods wanted. Do you know, the Bible says something very interesting about Abraham. It says that Abraham became a wandering Aramean. And why did he become a wandering Aramean? Do you know, he may have become a wandering Aramean because he couldn't settle down anywhere. Because had he settled down anywhere, the people probably would have killed him. Because he was a painful reminder in their midst that they had all made a terrible mistake in killing their child. Because here was a man who dared to defy the gods, who dared to defy conventional wisdom, who dared to believe maybe that's not what the gods wanted. A man whose very presence and whose son's presence was a reminder to everyone that they'd all made a tragic mistake in sacrificing their children. And yet Abraham clearly enjoyed God's blessing and protection, even though he hadn't made that sacrifice. So the Bible says he became a wandering Aramean. So it's quite possible that the real test of faith for Abraham was not whether or not he could kill Isaac, but whether or not he could let Isaac live. In fact, it appears that Abraham actually had two tests. The first was whether or not he could kill Isaac, and he passed that test because he proved he was willing to do it when he felt called to do it. But the second test was whether or not he could let Isaac live, and he passed that test too when God told him to spare his child. But of the two tests, the harder may have been the latter, to let Isaac live and to go back into that community of people, every one of whom had sacrificed their firstborn child with his child still alive, and to put up with their resentment. But what did Abraham care? He still had his kid, you know? What did he care what people thought? He still had his son. So it could be that the real test of faith for Abraham was not whether or not Abraham could sacrifice Isaac, but whether or not he could let Isaac live. I'd like you to notice that, because I believe that's the real test of faith for us too. Meaning, the real test of faith in your life and mine is not how much we can sacrifice, but how fully can we live our life. It's because just like the people of that ancient world, many of us hold the notion that what God really wants from us is great sacrifice, and that what God really wants is to see how much we can give up. The fact of the matter is, with the resurrection of Jesus, the true God has revealed himself to us and basically said, I'm a God of life, not death. And if you really want a test of faith, can you go back into that community and live your life to the full? Live your life to the full. And that's the only thing God ever asks of us, is to live life to the full. Jesus says, I've come that you might have life and have it to the full. Life is the only thing God offers. Life is the only thing he ever calls us to. And to live that life to the full is the only thing he ever asks of us. In fact, the only reason why God might ever ask us to sacrifice something is so that we can live life more fully. The only reason why God might ever ask us to deny ourselves and to give something up is because the thing we give up is bad for us. And he knows that giving it up will help us to live a healthier, happier life. But with the resurrection of Jesus, God says, I am a God of life, not death. And the only thing he ever calls us to is life, and to live it to the full.